Welcome back. Today we're going to be working with SQL, specifically the aggregate functions, and so we want to take a look at them. When we're talking about aggregate functions, when we've done functions earlier, we've been done functions using a single cell or a group of individual cells to perform some calculation, usually using things like numeric values or strings. However, when we want to talk about an aggregate function, what we're talking about is we're going to get an entire column's worth of values. We're going to do something across an entire column's worth of structure, and so that's where we have a column versus a single cell's worth of values when we're talking about an aggregate. So again, when your vocab, we're aggregating those values together to pull them together, using that level bit of vocabulary there. When we're writing an actual function itself, the structure of a function is still the same. So in the case of sum, pass it a parameter of score as total scores. Again, anytime you're using the magic power of a function, you always want to have that as on there because we don't want to reveal as part of our actual result what that is right here, especially when you're passing this information to results that are something like that. We're having a space in that can potentially cause problems when you're passing it as the metadata to some other program. Again, round GPA comma 2 as my GPA. When we're doing an aggregate function, we're operating, like I said, on the entire column of values from whatever table we've created as our final result from our from, join, on, where, etc. clauses as we pull that into the select. And so it's working those entire columns of values instead of a single field. One of the things we're working about when we're talking about using the aggregate functions, you must keep track of any of the fields that are being used that are not an aggregate. So any of your fields you have inside your select query that aren't aggregated, you need to make sure you explicitly call those out because you're going to need to use them in another function. Excuse me. You're going to need to use those other fields in a new clause that we haven't looked at yet. So we have to make sure that we keep track of them on that. So we have our, again, we're operating entire columns of values, and we have to track every field that is not part of that so we can use it in one of our new clauses. Speaking of new clauses, but wait, there's more. We have new clauses we have to use when we're talking about using aggregate functions. The new clause, we have the first one. Notice the stars right here. Notice how this, if I could have a flashing little thing here and then go bam, bam, bam. The group by clause is something you really need to keep track of. The group by clause is how we actually organize our structure when we're working within an aggregate function. We have to make sure when we're using an aggregate function, we use the group by clause so we can keep track of every single field that's not used in aggregate. So you need this one. This is a mandatory clause when you're working with aggregate functions anytime you have anything that's not aggregate, which is like, what, 98 billion% of the time? And so this clause has to have all the non-aggregate fields, especially from the select clause in there. Exclamation point right here. Again, this is from the select. This is only the select where it has to be listed. Now, what if we want to actually winnow our results down? We want to use that magic power of funneling our structure. When we use a where clause, we can do that when we're working with a regular function. But when we want to limit our results with an aggregate function, instead we have to add another new clause, our second new clause, the having clause. The having clause is like a where clause, but it's for aggregate functions. It's so I can winnow my results using that lovely power of an aggregate function instead of simply winnowing like we do with a where. So again, just as a quick reminder, the having clause is like where. It's how I winnow my results, but I have to use this when I want to winnow results with an aggregate function. My group by clause is the one that's required. You need this one when you're working with any of the aggregate functions so you can actually order your structure, your results. It's really especially helpful when you're working with things like, say, for example, sum or count, because you can actually organize our structures with that. Finally, when we keep track of that, that's why we track all our fields that we don't actually have inside our aggregate functions, because that's what goes inside that group by clause. And finally, again, we're talking about actual aggregate functions. It's how I work with entire columns worth of results instead of simply a single field. Column versus field, because when I aggregate, I'm pulling together. And that's a quick review of how you can use an aggregate function using SQL. Thanks again. Have a great day. Cheers.